I didn't plan to think about you today. It just happened. Something small broke my focus, a moment, a silence, and suddenly I understood what I'd been avoiding. The truth wasn't loud, but it hurt. Because painful realizations don't come to destroy you. They come to remind you of what you lost. I thought moving forward meant leaving everything behind. I told myself distance was healing. But today I realized something painful. Some connections don't fade, they wait. Not for the right time, for the right honesty, and in that moment of clarity, when excuses fell apart and silence said more than words ever did, I was led back to you. Pain has a strange way of surfacing when you least expect it, not as a sharp blow, but as a quiet realization that settles in your chest and refuses to move. Today wasn't dramatic. Nothing went wrong, nothing collapsed, and yet something inside me finally gave way. I had convinced myself that moving forward meant cutting ties with everything that once slowed me down. I told myself that distance was growth, that silence was strength, that leaving things unresolved was better than reopening old wounds. It sounded logical, it felt controlled, and for a long time it worked. Or at least it distracted me. I stayed busy. I filled my days with momentum, my nights with exhaustion. When thoughts tried to drift backward, I pushed them away with reason. I reminded myself why I left, why I chose space, why it was necessary at the time. I believed that understanding the reasons was enough to neutralize the feeling, but understanding doesn't erase attachment. It only delays it. Today, something small broke through that delay. A moment of stillness I didn't plan for. No noise, no urgency, just space, and suddenly I felt the weight of what had been missing. Not the chaos, not the conflict, you. I realized that I never truly processed the loss. I just outpaced it. I mistook progress for healing. I thought that as long as I was moving forward, I couldn't be pulled backward. But emotions don't follow timelines. They wait. They stay patient. And when you finally slow down, they speak. What hurt wasn't remembering you. What hurt was realizing how intentionally I had avoided doing so. I replayed moments I hadn't allowed myself to sit with before, not the dramatic ones, the quiet ones, the conversations that didn't end badly, the understanding that didn't need explanation, the comfort that felt ordinary until it was gone. I realized how rare that kind of connection was. I didn't miss you because of loneliness. I missed you because of clarity. Because today, without distraction, I could finally see the difference between what was temporary and what was meaningful. I used to believe that letting go meant forgetting, but letting go, I'm learning, sometimes means acknowledging what still matters without running from it. And you still mattered, not as a regret, not as a mistake, but as a truth I hadn't fully faced. I asked myself whether returning to these thoughts meant weakness, whether revisiting the past meant I'd failed to move on. But the more honest question was this: was I strong enough to admit that leaving didn't erase the bond, it just postponed the conversation? Painful realizations don't ask for permission. They arrive when you're ready, not when you're prepared. And today, I was ready enough to admit that I didn't lose you because it didn't matter. I lost you because timing, fear, and self-protection spoke louder than honesty. Because I chose certainty over vulnerability. Because I believed I could replace depth with distance. I couldn't. You weren't a chapter I closed. You were a line I underlined and kept pretending I'd forgotten. And coming back to that truth didn't feel like regression. It felt like alignment, like something inside me finally stopped resisting what it had always known. This wasn't about undoing the past. It was about understanding it. About recognizing that some connections don't disappear just because you walk away. They stay, not to haunt you, but to teach you what mattered enough to hurt. Today didn't bring answers, it brought honesty. And honesty, even when it's painful, is where healing actually begins. Once that realization settled in, everything else felt louder. The silence I used to hide and no longer felt safe, it felt unfinished. I began noticing how carefully I had edited my own memories, keeping only the versions that justified my leaving, never the ones that questioned it. I told myself I walked away because it was necessary, because staying would have meant uncertainty, because I didn't know how to balance what I felt with everything else I was trying to hold together. Those reasons weren't lies, but they weren't the whole truth either. The truth was harder to admit. I was afraid of how deeply it mattered. I was afraid that choosing you would require me to slow down in ways I didn't know how to afford at the time. Afraid that love would ask me to prioritize presence over progress. And I didn't trust myself to do that without resentment. So I chose distance instead. Clean, logical, defensible, or so I thought. But distance doesn't erase attachment. It just changes its shape. It turns it into something quieter, something you can ignore until the noise stops and you're forced to hear it. I realized how often I compared others to you without meaning to, not in obvious ways, in subtle ones, in how conversations flowed, in how understood I felt, in how safe it was to be honest without rehearsing. No one else fit that rhythm, and that wasn't fair to them or to me. I saw now how carefully I had protected myself from regret by avoiding reflection. Reflection requires stillness, and stillness leaves you alone with the truth. That truth being, I didn't leave because love failed. I left because I didn't know how to stay without losing parts of myself I was still trying to build. That realization didn't make me want to go back immediately. It made me want to understand myself better first, to separate fear from wisdom, to recognize which choices came from clarity and which came from avoidance. I thought about the version of me you knew, not the strongest version, not the most accomplished one, but the one that hadn't yet learned how to hide behind momentum. You saw me before I mastered emotional efficiency, before I learned how to compartmentalize everything that didn't fit neatly into forward motion. You didn't demand more from me than I had. You accepted what I could offer at the time, and instead of seeing that as safety, I saw it as risk. That was my mistake. I'd learned how to manage complexity everywhere else in life, but when it came to emotions, I wanted simplicity, clear outcomes, defined paths. Love didn't offer that. It offered uncertainty wrapped in sincerity. And sincerity requires courage. I wondered whether reaching back toward you now meant reopening something that should stay closed. Whether understanding the past meant disturbing peace I'd worked hard to create. But the peace I built was incomplete because it depended on ignoring something that still mattered. You weren't a loose end. You were a lesson I hadn't finished learning. I began to accept that pain doesn't always mean something went wrong. Sometimes it means something was real enough to leave a mark, and not every mark needs to be erased. I wasn't romanticizing what we had. I wasn't rewriting history. I was seeing it clearly for the first time, without the urgency, without the fear, without the need to justify my choices. I saw both the beauty and the limitation, the connection and the timing, the honesty and the hesitation, and in that clarity I realized something important. Going back to you didn't necessarily mean returning to the past. It meant returning to the part of myself that was willing to feel without calculating the outcome. I didn't know what I would do with that realization yet. I didn't need to. For the first time, I allowed myself to sit with it instead of rushing toward a decision. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to act. It's to stay present with the truth long enough to understand it. And understanding, even when it's painful, is a step toward something real. As the days passed, I noticed how that realization followed me everywhere. It wasn't loud or demanding. It didn't interrupt my routine. It simply stayed, quietly reshaping the way I saw things. I stopped rushing through moments. I paused more often, not because I was lost, but because I was finally paying attention. I began to see how much of my life had been built around momentum. Forward motion had become my default response to discomfort. If something felt heavy, I moved faster. If something felt uncertain, I buried it under progress. It worked, but only up to a point, because momentum can carry you far, but it can't carry you inward. You represented that inward space. Thinking about you didn't pull me backward. It brought me into the present in a way nothing else did. It reminded me that clarity doesn't always come from distance. Sometimes it comes from proximity to what you've been avoiding. I noticed how my memories of you had changed. They weren't sharp anymore. They weren't painful in the way loss usually is. They were steady, grounded, almost warm. That's when I understood something important. What I missed wasn't the intensity, it was the understanding. I'd confused intensity with meaning for a long time. The dramatic highs and lows felt like proof that something mattered, but those extremes fade. What remains is how someone made you feel in the quiet, unguarded moments. With you, I felt known without being examined, seen without being measured. That's rare. I realized how much energy I'd spent protecting myself from vulnerability instead of learning how to hold it responsibly. I'd treated openness like an all or nothing risk. Either you give everything or you give nothing. There was no middle ground, but the middle ground is where real connection lives. I began questioning the stories I'd told myself about why things ended. They were convenient narratives, clean explanations. They helped me move on without looking too closely. But now, looking honestly, I saw the gaps, the moments where fear spoke louder than truth, where timing became an excuse instead of a factor. That didn't make me resent myself. It made me more compassionate toward the version of me who didn't know how to do better yet. Growth doesn't mean judging who you were. It means understanding why you were that way. I wondered if you ever thought about me, not in a nostalgic way, just in passing, the way you think of something that once mattered but no longer defines your present. The thought didn't hurt. It grounded me. It reminded me that connection doesn't require mutual awareness to be real. I wasn't entitled to your presence. I knew that. Coming back to you didn't mean expecting anything. It meant acknowledging something honestly and deciding what to do with that honesty. I realized that closure isn't something another person gives you. It's something you give yourself when you stop lying about what mattered, and you mattered, not as an unresolved chapter, not as a fantasy, but as a real connection that shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I stopped asking whether returning to you would be the right decision. That question assumed I needed to act immediately. I didn't. The more important question was whether I could live truthfully without acknowledging you. The answer was no. I could continue forward, building, achieving, expanding, and still feel that quiet misalignment underneath it all. Or I could face the discomfort of honesty and let it guide me, even if it didn't promise resolution. That's what led me back to you, not nostalgia, not regret, but alignment. I wasn't chasing what was. I was responding to what still was, and once I admitted that, everything else started to make sense. Coming back to you wasn't a sudden decision. It was a gradual surrender to truth, the kind that doesn't argue, doesn't demand, and doesn't leave room for denial. I didn't arrive with expectations or rehearsed explanations. I arrived with clarity, and clarity has its own weight. I understood now that avoidance had been my way of staying in control. If I didn't revisit what mattered, I didn't have to risk being changed by it again. But control is fragile. It cracks the moment honesty shows up uninvited, and honesty had shown up. I thought about how easily I used to confuse certainty with safety. If I knew the outcome, I felt protected. If something was unpredictable, I kept my distance, but love doesn't offer guarantees. It offers opportunity to grow, to fail, to deepen, and rejecting that opportunity doesn't make you safer, it makes you smaller. I saw how carefully I'd learned to minimize emotional exposure, how often I chose logic when emotion asked for courage, how many times I convinced myself that independence meant never needing to return to unfinished conversations. But unfinished doesn't mean broken. Sometimes it just means deferred. I didn't come back to relive the past. I came back because the present felt incomplete without acknowledging it. I didn't need to recreate what we had. I needed to honor what it taught me. You taught me that connection doesn't have to be intense to be meaningful. That consistency speaks louder than passion. That being understood is more powerful than being admired. Those lessons stayed with me long after we parted. They shaped how I showed up elsewhere. They changed what I looked for. They raised the standard of what felt real, and nothing else ever quite matched it. That realization didn't make me desperate. It made me deliberate. I knew that coming back didn't mean things would resume effortlessly. Time changes people. Growth reshapes priorities. I respected that. I wasn't returning to claim something. I was returning to listen. I accepted the possibility that you may have moved on, that your life might no longer have space for this honesty, and if that was true, I would still be glad I returned. Because avoiding truth is heavier than facing rejection. What mattered was alignment with myself first. I learned that love isn't proven by how long you hold on, but by how honestly you're willing to show up when it counts. Showing up without demands, without entitlement, without rewriting history to serve your comfort. I wasn't looking to undo what happened. I was looking to move forward without pretending it never mattered. Coming back to you meant allowing myself to be changed by reflection instead of resisting it. It meant accepting that growth sometimes asks you to revisit what shaped you, not to stay there, but to understand how it fits into who you are now. I wasn't chasing closure, I was choosing truth, and truth has a way of softening you without weakening you. If this was the end, I could accept it. If it was a beginning, I would approach it differently with patience, humility, and awareness. No urgency, no pressure, just presence. I had learned the cost of silence. I wasn't willing to pay it again. So I came back not to ask for something, but to acknowledge something, to say that what we shared mattered, that it still does, and that pretending otherwise no longer served either of us. Some realizations hurt because they arrive late, but some arrive exactly when you're ready to listen. This one led me back to you, not as I was, but as someone who finally understands why it mattered in the first place. Today's realization didn't bring certainty. It brought honesty, and honesty is heavier than answers. I didn't come back to rewrite the past or to ask it to change. I came back because pretending it didn't matter was costing me more than facing the truth ever could. I understand now that walking away doesn't always mean letting go. Sometimes it just means postponing the moment you're ready to admit what stayed with you. You stayed with me, not as regret, not as longing, but as a quiet reference point for what real connection feels like. This wasn't about regret, it was about responsibility. Responsibility to acknowledge what shaped me. Responsibility to stop carrying unfinished truths forward disguised as strength. I don't expect anything from you. Not forgiveness, not answers, not a return. Coming back was never about outcome. It was about alignment, about choosing to live honestly instead of efficiently. Some connections don't ask to be resumed. They ask to be recognized. If this is where our paths finally pause, I can accept that with clarity instead of avoidance. And if this is where something begins again, it will be with patience, awareness, and respect for everything time has changed. Either way, I'm no longer running from what mattered. Painful realizations hurt because they strip away illusions, but they also return you to yourself, to the parts you abandoned to keep moving. And today, that return led me back to you, not to reclaim the past, but to finally stand in the truth of it.